The soft thud of Natalie Simmons's running shoes against the pavement created a steady rhythm in the quiet of the early morning. Each step was deliberate, her stride a practiced cadence that let her mind wander while her body moved with precision. Her breath flowed in sync with her pace, calm and controlled, as the world around her began to wake. The suburban neighborhood was still cloaked in the hush of dawn. Porch lights cast faint glows. Sprinklers whispered in the distance, and the occasional hum of a garage door signaled the start of someone's day. The air carried the scent of dew-soaked grass and the earthy promise of a new morning, the cool of night giving way to the gentle warmth of the rising sun. Natalie had chosen this place for its serenity, its predictability. After years of navigating war zones, where every shadow could hide a sniper and every step demanded caution, she craved the ordinary. A quiet street, a simple routine somewhere she could let her guard down, even if only a little. But the instincts honed in combat never truly left her. As she ran, her senses stayed sharp, cataloging the world around her, the car idling too long at a corner 2 blocks back, the faint twitch of a curtain in a house she'd never seen occupied, the low rumble of an engine starting behind her too slow, too deliberate to be casual. When the sound of tires rolling closer broke the morning stillness, Natalie didn't falter. She adjusted her pace, her breathing steady, and flicked her eyes to the side without turning her head. A police cruiser, its blue and white stripes stark in the soft light, crept alongside her, hugging the curb too closely for a routine pass. She kept her gaze forward, her muscles taut but restrained, resisting the urge to react too soon. Then a voice sliced through the quiet, sharp and commanding. "Hey, stop right there!" Natalie slowed to a stop, her breath even, her heartbeat calm. She turned to face the cruiser as its doors opened with a heavy creak. 2 officers stepped out, their presence carrying the weight of authority unchallenged for far too long. The older one, broad-shouldered with graying hair peeking from under his cap, moved with the slow deliberation of someone who'd worn the badge for decades. His hand brushed his holster, a gesture that could seem accidental but wasn't. The younger officer, lean and wiry, wore a smirk that betrayed his eagerness, his eyes glinting with the thrill of control. "What are you doing out here?" the older officer asked, his voice flat, less a question than a demand for her to confirm his assumptions. Natalie wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, meeting his gaze with unshaken calm. "Jogging." The younger one scoffed, glancing at his partner with a shake of his head. "Jogging, huh? Funny. We got a call about a suspicious person moving through the neighborhood." The words hung in the air, heavy with intent. Suspicious person, a phrase vague enough to mean anything, flexible enough to justify whatever they wanted. Natalie let a slow breath fill her chest, her expression unreadable. "Suspicious how?" The older officer tilted his head, as if deciding whether her question deserved an answer. Didn't say. Just that someone was moving between houses seemed out of place. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady, controlled. "I live here." The younger officer's smirk widened as he crossed his arms. "Sure you do. Got ID on you." Natalie didn't flinch. She'd seen this script before, played out this moment in her mind too many times, not because she wanted to, but because survival demanded it. "I don't carry ID when I run," she said, her tone even, giving them nothing to seize. The older officer sighed, his eyes sweeping over her in a way that wasn't about verification, but about finding an excuse. "That's convenient," he muttered, the doubt in his voice undisguised. Natalie stayed silent, refusing to fill the space with the reaction they craved. The younger officer, growing restless, took a step closer. "So, let me guess you live just a few blocks away. Right in East House? Good job." The mockery in his tone was unmistakable, his words dripping with disbelief. She didn't take the bait, didn't shift her stance. "I belong here," she said, her voice firm, unyielding. The younger one chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, prove it." "Am I being detained?" Natalie asked, her eyes locked on theirs, unflinching. The question hung in the air, thickening the tension. This wasn't just about this moment, it was about every moment like it. Every time she'd been made to feel like she didn't belong. Every time power had been wielded to remind her of her place. The older officer hesitated, his jaw tightening before he answered. Not yet. The words weren't a reassurance. They were a threat. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the street. A few houses down, an elderly couple lingered by their driveway, glancing over while pretending not to. A man watering his lawn tilted his head just enough to watch. Natalie wasn't just being questioned, she was being put on display, a spectacle for the neighborhood to witness. The younger officer shifted, his fingers inching closer to his belt. The movement deliberate, meant to intimidate. This wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about dominance. The older officer's voice cut through the silence. Look, you cooperate, and we'll be on our way. Just doing our job. Natalie held his gaze, her body still, her breath steady. She could have played along, nodded, smiled. Let them feel victorious so they'd leave her alone. But she was done with that game. The younger officer, his patience fraying, shook his head. Come on, lady. Let's not make this difficult. His hand moved again, closer to his belt, his body tensing in a way only someone trained to spot aggression would notice. Inside Natalie, something shifted. The weight of her past of war, of survival, of facing down threats far greater than these two men settled into her bones. She stood her ground, her posture relaxed but deliberate, her eyes steady. She had faced insurgents in hostile territories, survived missions where hesitation meant death, and dismantled threats with nothing but her training and will. This moment, on a quiet suburban street with two officers itching for an excuse, was different but familiar. The younger officer's smirk was gone now, replaced by agitation. His shoulders squared, his stance widened, a subtle shift that screamed escalation. He wasn't waiting for compliance anymore. He was waiting for defiance. You're making this harder than it has to be, he said, his fingers hovering too close to his belt. Just answer the damn questions and stop acting like you've got something to hide. Natalie kept her hands visible, knowing how quickly this could spiral. I've answered your questions, she said, her voice calm but unyielding. I live here. I was running. That's not a crime. The older officer's jaw clenched. You're refusing to show identification. I told you, I don't carry ID when I run, she repeated, her tone steady as steel. The younger one let out an exaggerated sigh, stepping closer. See, this is the problem, he muttered. People like you. He stopped as the older officer raised a hand, his face betraying no concern, only calculation. He was weighing his options, deciding how far to push. But Natalie already knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What officers Holloway and Mercer didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was who they were dealing with. They saw a black woman alone, an easy target to intimidate, someone they could bend to their will. They didn't see a Navy SEAL, a woman forged in the crucible of war, trained to endure, to fight, to dismantle any threat in her path. They didn't see the storm they'd just unleashed. When they tased her, when they cuffed her, when they told her to stay in her place, they thought they'd won. They thought they'd asserted their power, that she'd shrink under the weight of their authority. But Natalie didn't want justice in the way they understood it. She didn't want apologies or settlements. She wanted them to feel the fear they'd inflicted, to know the vulnerability they'd forced on her. And she was patient, methodical, unrelenting. Now, the same officers who once strode through their precinct with unshakable confidence walk with a different gait. They glance over their shoulders, their lives unraveling thread by thread. The control they once gripped so tightly is slipping through their fingers, and the fear they used to wield as a weapon is now their own. Because Natalie Simmons doesn't forget, she doesn't forgive. And by the time she's done, Holloway and Mercer will understand exactly what happens when you push the wrong person too far. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street, where the air buzzed with an undercurrent of tension. Natalie stood her ground, her eyes locked on the two officers in front of her. Their presence wasn't accidental. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the way they sized her up, testing how far they could push before she'd push back. Down the block, curious eyes began to emerge. An elderly couple paused in their driveway, the man still clutching a hose that poured water onto an already sodden lawn, and vague shapes moved behind curtained windows. The officers didn't like the attention, but they weren't about to let her slip away either. The older officer, Holloway, shifted his weight, exhaling sharply through his nose. "All right," he said, his tone calm but laced with an edge, like a parent tired of arguing with a stubborn child. "Let's keep this simple. Turn around, hands on your head." Natalie's fingers twitched, a faint warmth stirring beneath her skin, like the first spark of a fire. "What's the charge?" she asked, her voice steady, unwavering. Holloway's eyes narrowed, unreadable. "You're obstructing an investigation. We're detaining you until we can confirm who you are." Detaining, not arresting, not charge, just removing her from the street, making sure she knew exactly where she stood in their world. The younger officer, Mercer, let a smirk creep across his face. "Unless you feel like resisting," he said, his hand now deliberately resting on his belt, fingers brushing the grip of his taser. Natalie knew the game. Compliance meant a public walk of shame paraded through booking, handcuffs glinting for the neighborhood to see, her dignity stripped for their amusement. Resistance, even a hint of it, would give them the excuse they craved to escalate, to label her a threat, to use force. Either way, they won. They got their power, their control, their dominance. Her pulse stayed even, her breathing calm, though every muscle in her body coiled with the instinct to fight. She wasn't reckless, though she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. "I'm not resisting," she said, raising her hand slightly but refusing to turn. "I'm asking what authority you have to detain me without cause." Holloway's lips pressed into a tight line, his patience fraying. "Last chance," he warned. Mercer scoffed, shaking his head. "Told you, Holloway. She's been casing houses. I called it." Holloway nodded, as if convincing himself. "Yeah," and refusing to cooperate. Natalie's jaw clenched. This was theater, a performance scripted to justify whatever they'd already decided to do. Holloway lifted his radio, his voice clipped. "Dispatch, we've got a possible suspect refusing to cooperate. Send additional units." The faint crackle of the radio response sent a jolt through her. They didn't need backup. This was about escalation, about turning the routine stop into a spectacle. Within minutes, another cruiser rounded the corner, its lights flashing silently. A third officer stepped out, and the air shifted thicker, heavier, more dangerous. Nearby, a door creaked open. Someone was recording. "Good," the backup officer said, striding forward. "What's the situation?" Holloway didn't hesitate. "Possible suspect for casing houses. Won't provide ID. Won't cooperate." "Ale." Delivered with the ease of practice. The backup officer nodded, his hand already on his holster as he took position behind the others. Natalie drew a slow breath. "I told you. I live here." Mercer snorted. "Then why are you making this so hard?" Her voice cut like a blade. "Because I know my rights." Something flickered in Holloway's eyes, annoyance. Maybe impatience, or even a twisted amusement at her defiance. Before she could react, Mercer's hand shot to his taser. She caught the glint of it a split second before the sharp pop of electrodes tore through the air. A bolt of electricity slammed into her, searing through her nerves, locking her muscles in a vise of white-hot pain. Her knees buckled, her breath escaping in a choked gasp as she hit the pavement hard. The world blurred, the rough asphalt scraping her cheek, the acrid smell of burned ozone clogging her lungs. Voices swirled above her, distorted. "Get her hands. Stop resisting." Rough hands yanked her arms behind her back, the cold bite of steel cuffs snapping around her wrists. Her vision swam, her limbs trembling from the lingering current. Through the haze, she heard the murmurs of neighbors, the faint clicks of phone cameras, chattered whispers she couldn't quite decipher. She hadn't resisted not once, but here she was, face down on the street, cuffed, powerless, for no reason other than existing in a place they didn't think she belonged. The pavement was unforgiving beneath her, the taser's sting still pulsing through her like a fading echo. She focused on her breathing, forcing it to stay even as her muscles twitched involuntarily. A knee pressed into her back, grinding her harder into the ground, the cuffs cutting deeper into her wrists. Above her, the officers moved with practiced precision, their words clipped, their actions a well-rehearsed routine. "Stop resisting," Mercer barked again, though she hadn't moved. The phrase wasn't for her, it was for the growing crowd, the neighbors spilling out of their homes, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Early risers, still clutching coffee mugs, stood frozen on porches and sidewalks, some with phones raised, capturing the scene. No one spoke up. No one stepped forward. Natalie's eyes darted across the ground, catching glimpses of faces half hidden by the morning glare. Some looked concerned, others wary, but all stayed rooted in place. She understood why. She'd seen it before, the fear, not of the injustice unfolding, but of what might happen if they got involved. A hand gripped her arm, yanking her to her feet. The cuffs bit into her wrists as her still weak legs struggled to hold her weight. Mercer's smirk had sharpened, laced with the thrill of control. "See what happens when you don't cooperate," he muttered, his voice low, meant only for her. His fingers tightened on her bicep. "You people never learn." Natalie's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. Holloway scanned the crowd, his eyes flicking between faces, reading the tension, the cameras, the shifting energy. He didn't like the scrutiny. They'd expected quick compliance, a quiet arrest, not an audience. "Let's move her," he said to Mercer, "before this gets messy." They marched her toward the cruiser, her muscles aching with each forced step. Natalie kept her head high, her face a mask of control, refusing to let them see even a flicker of weakness. As they neared the vehicle, she caught the eye of an older black man standing outside his house, phone in hand, his expression unreadable. She knew what he was thinking, that recording wouldn't change a thing. It had happened before. It would happen again. Mercer shoved her into the back seat with unnecessary force, and she braced herself to avoid slamming into the opposite door. The cruiser's door slammed shut, sealing her inside. Through the window, she could still see the crowd, the uneasy glances, the silent exchanges, the weight of their inaction. She didn't expect anyone to fight for her. She'd been fighting for herself too long to hope otherwise. Holloway slid into the driver's seat, Mercer beside him, their movements casual, routine, as if this were just another morning. The radio crackled. "Unit 37 en route," Holloway said, his tone flat. "Affirmative. Bringing suspect in now." The word suspect hung heavy in the stale air of the back seat, wrapping around her like a chain. Mercer glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his smirk still lingering as his fingers drummed lazily on the dashboard. "Gotta say, you made this a lot harder than it needed to be." Natalie didn't respond. Her mind was already shifting, moving past the pain in her wrists, the ache in her muscles, the faint ringing in her ears. This wasn't the first time she'd been restrained, but it was the first time it had happened like this, public, brazen, unprovoked. The cruiser pulled away, the neighborhood fading behind her, the crowd's murmurs replaced by the hum of tires on asphalt. Mercer chuckled, glancing at Holloway. "Bet you $20 she's got a record. Want to check?" Holloway said nothing, his grip tight on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. Natalie turned her head slightly, her voice smooth and measured through the barred partition. "I hope you do check. You might learn something." Mercer laughed again, shaking his head as he angled himself to get a better look at her. "Man, you really don't get it. Do you? Doesn't matter what's on your record." The weight of the handcuffs bit into Natalie's wrists, a cold, unyielding reminder of the moment her morning jog had turned into a nightmare. She sat in the back of the police cruiser, the hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the radio filling the silence. Officer Mercer, slouched in the driver's seat, threw a glance at her through the rearview mirror. "Doesn't matter who you think you are." "Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "you could be the president, and you'd still be right there, cuffed and quiet." Natalie met his eyes, her face a mask of calm resolve. "I know exactly who I am," she replied, her tone steady, unshaken. Mercer snorted, rolling his eyes as he turned his focus back to the road. "Yeah, and where's that getting you?" The cruiser rolled on, the police station growing closer with every turn, its looming presence a stark contrast to the suburban streets they passed. The ache in her muscles, the sting of the cuffs, the low drone of the radio, it all pieced together in her mind, like fragments of a puzzle she was already solving. She wasn't thinking about the booking process, the paperwork, or the holding cell that awaited her. Her mind was racing ahead, plotting the steps she'd take once the cuffs were off, though their imprint would linger like a scar. Inside the station, Natalie was led to a small, windowless room that seemed designed to crush the spirit. The walls were a dull, lifeless gray, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the scratched, dented table in front of her. The table's surface bore the marks of countless others who had sat here, scuffs, gouges, and scratches etched into its metal like a record of broken hopes. This was a room meant to make people feel insignificant, to drown them in the heavy silence of isolation. But Natalie was neither small nor silent. She sat tall, her hands still bound, her gaze fixed on the door. They left her there for over an hour, no explanation, no charges, no paperwork. Just the deliberate, grinding weight meant to wear her down, to make her question whether fighting back was worth the cost. She'd faced worse, far worse, in places where the stakes were life and death. Being cuffed for jogging in her own neighborhood was almost absurd in comparison, a bitter irony that made her lips twitch with the ghost of a smile. Almost. When the door finally creaked open, Officer Holloway stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate, exuding the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His uniform was pristine, his belt perfectly aligned, every detail screaming authority. He dragged the metal chair across the tiled floor with a grating screech, sat down, and let out a sigh, as if this whole ordeal was a minor annoyance for him rather than a gross misuse of power. "Well," he said, leaning back, his voice thick with condescension, "looks like you're clean." Natalie didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, a wall of stone against his probing gaze. Holloway tilted his head, studying her like a predator sizing up prey, waiting for a crack in her composure. A flicker of fear or frustration? He'd be waiting a long time. "You're free to go," he continued, lacing his fingers together on the table. "No charges, just a misunderstanding." The word hung in the air, hollow and flimsy, a flimsy excuse for the reality she'd been tackled, tased, and dragged here in cuffs, all for existing in her own neighborhood. Natalie let the silence stretch, her eyes locked on his. "You tased and arrested me because I was jogging," she said, her voice calm but sharp, cutting through the pretense. Holloway's smirk didn't waver. "Because you refused to cooperate," he shot back, the same tired justification that always surfaced in moments like this. It was never about the officer's actions, always about the victim's failure to comply. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a pearl of wisdom. "Look, I'll be straight with you. This doesn't have to be a thing. Keep your head down, and you won't have any more problems. But if you keep pushing," he trailed off, shaking his head with mock sympathy, the unspoken threat clear. "Well, we both know how that goes." Natalie's fingers twitched beneath the table, her nails pressing into her palms. She'd heard warnings like this before in war zones, in shadowed back rooms, in places where power was wielded like a blade. She knew a veiled threat when she heard one, her lips parted, her voice smooth and unwavering. "Are we done here?" Holloway exhaled, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, we're done." Minutes later, she was walking out of the precinct, her belongings shoved across the counter by a smirking desk sergeant who offered no apology, no acknowledgement of the wrong done to her, just a look that said she was a fool who'd learned her place. They had misjudged her. Natalie wasn't the kind of woman who let things slide. She was the kind who took notes, who calculated her moves, who studied her opponents before striking. By the next morning, she was seated in the Internal Affairs Division, her report meticulously prepared. She'd spent the night poring over policy manuals, reviewing footage from neighbors' security cameras, and compiling every law and regulation that had been violated. She knew the system rarely held its own accountable, that complaints often vanished into a bureaucratic void. But this wasn't about expecting justice. It was about ensuring her name was on record, that Mercer and Holloway knew she wouldn't let them rewrite her story. The senior investigator across from her, a weary man in a navy suit, scanned her report with tired eyes, as if he'd seen too many of these to believe they'd change anything. When she finished recounting the incident, he set his pen down, exhaling through his nose. "We'll review the footage and conduct an internal investigation," he said, his voice flat, mechanical. "If any violations are found, appropriate action will be taken." Natalie caught the emphasis on if, the way his face betrayed no surprise, no outrage. He'd already decided this would go nowhere. "We'll be in touch," he added, offering a curt nod as he stood, signaling the meeting's end. She left the building with no illusions they'd bury her complaint, protect their own, file it away where it would never see daylight. But that was fine. She'd made her first move. Retaliation came, as she'd known it would. She'd read enough reports, heard enough stories to know how the system shielded its own. Officers like Holloway and Mercer, however, didn't let complaints go unanswered. Their goal wasn't to silence her outright, but to grind her down, to make her question whether resistance was worth it. It started small, subtle enough to pass as coincidence. The morning after she filed her complaint, she found her trash bin overturned in her driveway, its contents greasy wrappers, shredded papers, coffee grounds strewn across the pavement. She stared at it, her face unreadable, then pulled on gloves and cleaned it up without a word. It was annoying, not threatening, but it was only the beginning. A few days later, she noticed a deep, jagged scratch along the driver's side of her car. At first, she thought it might have been an accident, a careless driver, a stray shopping cart in the grocery store lot. But then it happened again, this time across the trunk. The scratches deeper, more deliberate, as if someone had savored dragging the key through the paint. The message was clear. That night, she installed a motion-activated camera outside her garage, adjusting its angle to cover the driveway. She didn't expect to catch anything right away, but she wasn't one to wait passively. She'd watch, gather evidence, just as she had in hostile territories abroad. By the end of the week, the harassment escalated. Natalie woke early, stepping outside as dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds. The cool morning air brushed her skin as she approached her car, but a prickle of unease stopped her. She felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in the air, the sense of being watched. Then she spotted it, a dark, unmarked car parked down the street, not close enough to be obvious, but positioned for a clear view of her house. It wasn't a neighbor's car. She knew every vehicle on her block. The tinted windows and idling engine confirmed her suspicions. She paused, her gaze lingering on the car for 10, 15 seconds. Most people would have moved by now if they were lost. The car stayed put. Exhaling slowly, Natalie turned away, acting as if she hadn't noticed. But the moment she was back inside, she moved to the front window, staying out of sight, and watched. The car lingered, a silent warning, before finally pulling away. She jotted down the time, the description, every detail. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Natalie stood frozen at her kitchen window, her breath steady, but her eyes locked on the unmarked car idling across the street. It had been there for nearly 20 minutes, its dark silhouette blending into the evening shadows, only betrayed by the faint glint of streetlight on its hood. Finally, it stirred, crawling forward with a deliberate slowness that felt almost mocking before it vanished around the corner. She let her eyelids flutter shut for a moment, a quiet exhale escaping her lips. So, this was their game. She didn't flinch, didn't reach for her phone, didn't let a single ripple disrupt the rhythm of her day. That was the point. They wanted her shaken, wanted her to feel their eyes boring into her every move. Over the next few days, the car became a constant, like a shadow that never quite touched her, but was always there. It never parked in the same spot twice, always shifting, adjusting, lingering just long enough to make its presence known without crossing into anything she could report. It hovered at the edge of her vision, a silent reminder that she was being watched. A week after she'd filed her complaint, she came home late from the gym, the neighborhood cloaked in the kind of stillness that amplified every sound. As she pulled into her driveway, a flicker of movement caught her eye, something darting near the side of her house, a shadow slipping out of sight in an instant. Her pulse didn't spike. She cut the engine. Sitting in the quiet, listening to the world outside, nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached under her seat, her fingers closing around the small knife she kept there. She flicked it open with a practiced ease, the blade catching the dim glow of her dashboard, before stepping out. Her eyes swept the yard, scanning the darkened corners of her property, every place where someone could crouch unseen. The motion light by her back fence snapped on, its harsh glow spilling across the grass. Something had triggered it. She moved toward it, her steps measured, the knife still in her hand. But when she reached the spot, there was no one, just her trash bin, its contents strewn across the ground. Natalie's jaw clenched as she crouched, sifting through the mess. Torn envelopes, bills, scraps of paperwork. Her name still legible on some. This wasn't random. They weren't after valuables or causing mindless chaos. They were digging, searching for something personal, something they could use. Her fingers tightened around a crumpled envelope, her knuckles whitening. This was no accident. It was calculated, a slow drip of intimidation, the kind she'd seen before in war zones, in covert operations, where fear was a weapon sharpened to a fine edge. They didn't want evidence. They didn't need to prove anything. They just wanted her afraid. She rose, her breath steady, her shoulders rolling back as she turned toward her front door. Fear wasn't in her vocabulary. They wanted her to hesitate, to second-guess herself, to wonder if pushing forward was worth the cost. But they'd misjudged her. This wasn't fear coursing through her veins, it was anger, hot and focused, the kind that fueled her instead of breaking her. Inside, Natalie sat at her dining table, a single lamp casting a soft glow over the papers spread before her, a keyed car, a rummaged trash bin, an unmarked vehicle that haunted her street. None of it was coincidence. She'd spent years studying the patterns of psychological warfare, and this was straight out of the playbook. First, surveillance, letting the target know they're exposed, vulnerable, then subtle disruptions, small acts that unsettle but never leave enough proof to act on. And finally, escalation, direct warnings that scream their intent. She'd seen these tactics used to break informants, to silence civilians in conflict zones, to control anyone who dared step out of line. Now they were being turned on her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. Marcus. She braced herself before answering. You still up? His voice was sharp, laced with a frustration he was barely holding back. Sleep's not really my thing these days, she replied, her tone dry. A pause hung between them before he spoke again. I heard about what's been going on. Of course he had. Marcus, a defense attorney who spent his days unraveling corruption most pretended didn't exist, always seemed to know things before she said a word. Talk to me, he said, softer now. Natalie leaned back, her fingers tracing the scratches on her car keys as her mind stitched together the timeline. They're watching me. That car's out there almost every night, never in the same spot. They're going through my trash, looking for leverage. And now, she reached for a stack of envelopes on the table, flipping through until she found the latest one. No return address, no stamp, just her name scrawled across it. She tore it open, revealing a single sheet of paper with blocky, uneven handwriting. Drop the complaint. Walk away. Now I'm getting letters, she said, her voice steady. Marcus was silent for a long moment before letting out a heavy sigh. Nat, don't tell me you're digging in on this. I'm telling you to be careful. He cut in. You know what happens when you go after cops. They don't fight fair. She knew. She also didn't care. This could ruin you. He pressed, his voice dropping. I'm already ruined, she shot back, her tone flat. Or haven't you noticed they've already started? Yesterday, an email had landed in her inbox from her contracting firm, requesting an immediate review of her security clearance. Natalie had built her career in counterterrorism fieldwork, intelligence, consulting. Her clearance was her lifeline. Without it, she couldn't work, couldn't access the contracts that kept her in the game. The review wasn't random. They were trying to dismantle her life, piece by piece. Marcus cursed under his breath. They're boxing you in. If they pull your clearance, you're done, blacklisted. Even if you win, you'll be untouchable. Natalie's fingers drummed against the table, her jaw tightening. It's not the first time someone's tried to burn me. Last time, you had the military behind you, he countered. This time, you're alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy. Just think about what's next, he said finally. You know I've got your back, but you need to be smart. She swallowed, nodding to herself. I'll handle it. She hung up before he could say more, her eyes drifting back to the letter. A warning, a desperate move to shove her out of the fight. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Natalie wasn't the type to sit back and wait for the next blow. She'd spent her career turning the tables in impossible situations, dismantling enemies not just with force, but with precision, exposing their vulnerabilities before they even knew they'd been seen. She'd let Holloway and Mercer play their game long enough. Now it was her turn. She didn't go back to the police station or waste time begging for justice from a system built to shield men like them. Instead, she made a call. Angela Reyes answered on the second ring. Please tell me this isn't a social call, Angela said, her voice dry. Natalie's lips twitched. Angela, a former naval intelligence officer turned private contractor, was a master at digging into lives, unbothered by the gray areas others shied away from. Need some research, Natalie said, keeping her tone even. Angela laughed softly. You don't do research, you do recon. Someone pissed you off. Natalie glanced out her window, where the unmarked car was back, half hidden behind another vehicle but unmistakable. I filed a complaint against 2 cops, she said. They're making my life hell. I need to know who they are, where they slip up, what keeps them up at night. Angela hummed thoughtfully. Names Holloway and Mercer, Brent Holloway, Doug Mercer, local PD. The sound of rapid typing filled the pause, the rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. All right, Angela said. I'll call you when I've got something. She hung up without another word. Natalie set her phone down, exhaling, feeling the shift inside her. After days of reacting, it felt good to strike first. 3 hours later, her phone buzzed again. You were right, Angela said. No preamble. They've got skeletons. Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. Talk to me. Holloway first, Angela began, her voice turning clinical. 20 years on the force. Record looks spotless, commendations, community work, all the shiny PR stuff. But his financials, they're a mess. Off-the-books real estate deals, properties flipping under shell companies, cash deposits that don't line up with his paycheck. No hard proof yet, but he's either taking dirty money or running something through those deals. Cops don't buy that many properties without a side hustle. Natalie's grip on the phone tightened. That was good. Very good. And Mercer, Angela snorted. Mercer's a different beast. The mess started small, a slow drip that turned into a flood. He had a gambling problem, nothing catastrophic at first, just a flutter on poker apps, a few bucks on sports bets, maybe a shady underground game or two. But over the past 6 months, it had spiraled into a beast he couldn't tame. Money was hemorrhaging faster than he could replace it, and the debts were piling up ugly. Unforgiving debts that didn't come with polite reminders. He'd been dipping into his savings, pulling out chunks that left his accounts gasping. But it wasn't enough. The hole was too deep, and he was drowning in it. Natalie's mind was already spinning, piecing together the puzzle. Holloway was the careful one, a man who moved like a chess player. Every step calculated, every risk measured. He was controlled, deliberate, the kind who wouldn't crack unless he was backed into a corner. Mercer, though, he was a different animal, reckless, impulsive, the kind of guy who'd swing first and figure out the consequences later. If Holloway was desperate, he'd hold out longer. But Mercer Natalie knew he'd break like brittle glass under the right pressure. Angela let out a heavy sigh over the phone, her voice tinged with exasperation. I can keep digging, Nat, but this is already a gold mine to work with. She paused, her tone softening. Hesitant. You know this doesn't end pretty, right? Natalie's eyes flickered shut for a moment, her lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. She glanced out her window at the shadowed car parked just down the street, the same one that had been tailing her for days, thinking they could scare her into backing off. I'm counting on it, she said, her voice low and steady. Luck wasn't Natalie's game. She played with strategy, with patience, with the kind of precision that found the exact fault line in a man's life and pressed until it shattered. Holloway thought he was untouchable, a man who skated just inside the rules enough to keep his hands clean while dipping his fingers into the shadows where no one was supposed to look. That was his mistake. He believed his badge, his position, his carefully constructed walls made him invincible. But Natalie had watched men like him crumble before, not from some dramatic public scandal, but from the quiet, creeping realization that their control was nothing but a fragile illusion. She started small. Angela, I need a favor, she said into the phone. Angela groaned, the sound of her fingers dancing across a keyboard filling the background. That's how all your calls start. What am I looking for this time? I want to hit Holloway where it stings, but he can't see the punch coming. A pause, then Angela's voice perked up. Money. Natalie smirked, always. Angela was already diving into records, her mind as sharp as ever. Cops like him don't live on their salaries. They've got side gigs, or they're pocketing something from someone. Give me a few hours, and I'll find the dirt. Natalie didn't need hours. The first crack appeared the next morning, born from a single anonymous email sent to a local investigative journalist. It was untraceable, vague enough to spark curiosity, but specific enough to start a fire. By sunrise, a story broke in the local news, a subtle jab. No names dropped, no direct accusations. Just a headline that whispered trouble. Unexplained property deals raise eyebrows among local law enforcement. It was the kind of story people skimmed and forgot until they didn't. Holloway's morning began like any other. He strolled into the precinct, exchanging nods with the officers on duty, pouring himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the break room's half-empty pot. But when he reached his desk, an email was waiting, an internal memo from the department, politely requesting clarification on his financial records. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, just a gentle tug at the threads of his confidence. Natalie could picture it, the way his jaw tightened, the slight hunch in his shoulders as he realized someone was peering into corners he'd kept hidden. That was the opening move. The second was bolder. 2 days later, Holloway pulled up to one of his properties, a modest rental he thought was buried under layers of paperwork, and froze. A for sale sign stood proudly in the front yard, its bright colors mocking him. He blinked, confusion giving way to irritation as he yanked the sign from the ground, inspecting it like it might confess who'd planted it. Before he could process it, his phone buzzed. Yeah, he answered, his voice rough. Brent, it's Mark from Sunrise Realty, the voice on the other end said. I've got people asking about the listing. There is no listing, Holloway snapped. A pause. That's weird because it's popped up on half a dozen real estate sites. Your name, your number, the works. Holloway's grip tightened on his phone as he pulled up the search results. There they were, active listings, multiple postings, all tied to him. Take them down, he ordered. His voice clipped. I'm trying, the realtor said, but this looks bad. Man, you don't want people thinking you're unloading properties in a hurry. Holloway didn't respond. His mind was already racing, sifting through enemies, rivals, anyone who could have pulled this off. The seed of paranoia had taken root, and Natalie wasn't done watering it. The final blow came late at night, at a property Holloway thought was a ghost, a rundown rental on the edge of town, hidden behind a web of LLCs. It was the kind of place that only mattered if you knew why it mattered. When he arrived, something felt off before he even stepped inside. No broken locks, no shattered windows, just a heaviness in the air that made his skin prickle. He moved cautiously, his hand hovering near his belt, though he knew he wouldn't need it. Everything was as he'd left it, except for the folder on the kitchen counter. His pulse quickened as he approached, Flipping it open with careful fingers, inside were pages of damning evidence proper transactions, financial records, reports tied to his name, a copy of the news article, and at the bottom, in neat, deliberate handwriting, a single note. How deep do you think they'll dig? Holloway stood frozen, his jaw clenched, staring at the papers. This wasn't a threat, it was a guarantee. He didn't call it in, didn't report a break-in. That would only invite questions. And questions were a luxury he couldn't afford. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of being watched. The hunter turned prey. Natalie shifted her focus to Mercer next. Holloway was the strategist, the one who played the long game. But Mercer was a loose cannon, sloppy, reactive, driven by impulse. He followed orders because he lacked the cunning to chart his own course. His badge gave him power, and he wielded it like a club, pushing people around without a second thought. But unlike Holloway, Mercer didn't know how to hide his messes. His weaknesses were laid bare, and Natalie knew exactly how to exploit them. Angela had already handed her the keys to Mercer's downfall. His gambling habit had started as a hobby, but had ballooned into an addiction over the past 6 months. He was in deep debts that didn't come with payment plans, but with quiet threats and men who collected in blood when cash ran dry. Natalie didn't need to drag him into the spotlight. She just needed to make sure the people he owed started tightening the screws. It started with a phone call. Angela had tracked down 2 loan sharks. Mercer was tangled up with men who operated in the gray edges of the law, powerful enough to make life hell for anyone who crossed them. Natalie fed them just enough Mercer's badge number, his work schedule, the bank account he'd bled dry, trying to stay afloat. She stepped back and let nature take its course. Once they realized a cop was dodging his debts, they'd handle the rest. The change in Mercer was almost instant. A week later, he shuffled into the precinct looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by tense shoulders and eyes that darted to every corner. When his phone buzzed, he flinched, staring at the screen too long before silencing it. His hands were never still rubbing his jaw, tapping his belt, betraying the storm inside him. Holloway noticed, his voice carrying a quiet suspicion when he asked if Mercer was handling things. Mercer wasn't handling anything. Natalie made sure of that. She'd studied his routine as closely as she'd studied Holloway's. Every Wednesday night, Mercer hit the same dive bar on the edge of town, a grimy hole in the wall where nobody asked questions, and he could drown his troubles in cheap whiskey. She was waiting in the shadows when he stumbled out, already on edge, his head swiveling as he scanned the empty lot for ghosts he couldn't name. His paranoia made him careless. He fumbled his keys, cursing as they clattered to the pavement. As he bent to grab them, Natalie moved like a whisper, slipping a folded note under his windshield wiper before melting back into the darkness. Mercer straightened, his gaze snapping to his car. His breath hitched when he saw the paper. With shaking hands, he snatched it, unfolding the single sheet. The words were simple, sharp. Pay what you owe before someone collects. His head jerked up, eyes wild as he scanned the lot. His body was rigid, his breathing ragged, the note crumpling in his grip. He turned in a slow circle, searching for a threat he'd never find. Natalie was already gone, but the message lingered, sinking its claws into him. In the days that followed, Mercer's grip on reality began to fray like a rope stretched too tight. The man who once strutted through the precinct with a swagger that bordered on arrogance now flinched at every creak of a floorboard, his eyes darting over his shoulder as if expecting a shadow to lunge. He'd grown jumpy, snapping at colleagues over minor slights, his temper a live wire sparking at the smallest provocation. And determined to outsmart whatever force he believed was stalking him, he abandoned his usual routines. He took winding back roads to work, avoided his favorite diner, and even ditched his Wednesday night ritual at the bar, too rattled to face the familiar faces that once brought him comfort. The world, to Mercer, had become a maze of unseen threats, and he was a man stumbling blindly through it. Natalie, however, was far from finished. Her campaign to dismantle Mercer's confidence was meticulous, each move calculated to tighten the screws just a little more. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, She crept into the police station's parking lot, her footsteps silent against the asphalt. With gloved hands, she placed a manila envelope on the hood of Mercer's squad car. It wasn't a bomb or a weapon, just a collection of forged documents, loan statements, overdue notices, and fabricated debts that painted a grim portrait of a man teetering on the edge of financial ruin. When Mercer discovered it the next morning, his reaction was visceral. He ripped the envelope open right there in the lot, his breaths coming in shallow gasps, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. His hands shook as he sifted through the papers, each page draining more color from his face. He looked like a man staring into an abyss, and Natalie knew she had him exactly where she wanted. She didn't stop there. Natalie's plan was a slow burn, designed to erode Mercer's sanity piece by piece. She left anonymous notes tucked under his windshield wiper, their cryptic warnings hinting at consequences for unpaid debts. She orchestrated moments that fed his growing paranoia, an unfamiliar car lingering too long outside his apartment. A stranger's glance held a second too long. Mercer, once the cocky cop who'd smirked as he snapped cuffs on Natalie's wrists, was unraveling. The bravado that had defined him was gone, replaced by a man who jumped at shadows and saw enemies in every corner. Natalie watched it all with a quiet satisfaction, her every move widening the cracks in his crumbling facade. But Mercer wasn't the kind to solve problems with logic. He was a man of action, the type who lashed out when cornered, and Natalie was counting on that. She needed him teetering on the brink, primed for one final push. It came on a chilly evening. Just as Mercer's shift ended, he shuffled out of the precinct, his shoulders slumped, his hand hovering near his holster like a nervous habit. The once confident enforcer was gone, replaced by a man worn thin by the constant dread of being hunted. The parking lot was nearly deserted, the streetlights casting eerie pools of light across the pavement. Natalie waited in the shadows, her plan poised to strike. As Mercer reached his car, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He froze, his fingers hovering over the screen, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes before he answered. Yeah. His voice was taut, laced with unease. Silence greeted him, followed by a low, distorted voice that sent a chill down his spine. Your time's running out. Mercer. His breath caught, and he spun around, eyes scanning the empty lot, his free hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Who the hell is this? He demanded. But the line went dead, leaving only the faint echo of steady breathing in his ears. Natalie, hidden in a nearby alley, clutched her burner phone, her voice disguised by a cheap app but dripping with menace. She watched as Mercer stood frozen, his chest heaving, his gaze darting wildly as if expecting an ambush. He didn't notice the note at first, a small slip of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. When he finally spotted it, his movements were frantic, his trembling fingers fumbling to unfold it. The words scrawled across the page were simple but devastating. You know what happens to guys who don't pay their debts? Mercer spun in a slow circle, his breathing ragged, his face a mask of desperation. Natalie had seen this before men pushed to their breaking point, their control slipping like sand through their fingers. Mercer climbed into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he sat there, staring into the darkness, as if trying to unravel the chaos that had consumed his life. When his phone rang again, he didn't answer. He hurled it onto the passenger seat, cursing under his breath before peeling out of the lot, his tires screeching against the pavement. Natalie stepped from the shadows, her work for the night complete. She had planted the final seed. And Mercer wasn't just scared anymore. He was desperate. Desperate men, she knew, made mistakes, and she was ready to capitalize on his. Mercer's descent was faster than Natalie had predicted, his unraveling more spectacular than she'd dared hope. The pressure had been building for weeks, each carefully placed jab chipping away at his fragile sense of control. His once confident stride was replaced by erratic, jittery movements, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. By the time a quiet Thursday evening rolled around, Mercer was a man barely holding himself together. Natalie had been tracking him, noting how he doubled back on his roots, scanned his surroundings like a hunted animal, and avoided the bars where he used to unwind. Sleep was a distant memory, evident in the dark circles under his eyes and the way his shoulders stayed tense even at rest. That night, he left the precinct early, skipping his usual haunts and heading straight home, but he never made it inside. As he stepped out of his car, he caught sight of a figure across the street, a man standing near a parked sedan, engrossed in his phone. To anyone else, it was an innocent scene, but in Mercer's fractured mind, it was proof of his worst fears. Someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip. Without a second thought, he reached for his gun. "Hey," he barked, his voice sharp and cracking as he stormed toward the stranger, his weapon drawn and trembling in his grip. "Hands where I can see them." The man barely had time to react before Mercer was on him, the barrel of his gun pressed against his chest. "What the hell do you want?" Mercer's voice was wild, his breathing erratic, his entire body coiled with tension. The man raised his hands slowly, his eyes calm despite the threat. "Detective Julian Reyes, Organized Crime Unit," he said, his tone steady as he flashed a badge that gleamed under the streetlight. Mercer blinked, his grip faltering, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him. He'd just drawn a weapon on an undercover investigator. Reyes didn't flinch. "You want to lower that before we both regret it?" Mercer stumbled back, his hands shaking as he holstered his gun, his voice trembling as he tried to salvage the moment. "What the hell are you doing here?" Reyes's expression remained unreadable. "Working a case," he said, pausing before adding, "Not everything's about you, Officer Mercer." But to Mercer, it was. The paranoia had consumed him, stripping away his reason and leaving him raw, exposed, and dangerously reckless. By the time word of the incident reached the precinct, Mercer's reputation was in tatters. But he wasn't the only one spiraling. Holloway, his partner, was unraveling in his own way. Unlike Mercer's explosive paranoia, Holloway's descent was quieter, more contained, a slow drowning in his own demons. He thought he could bury his troubles in whiskey, but Natalie knew better. She'd seen men like him before, men who believed they could outrun their pain only to find it waiting for them at the bottom of a glass. Holloway's decline started small missed calls, sloppy paperwork, showing up late to roll call, but it escalated one night at a dive bar, the kind of place where cops went to drink alone and no one asked questions. Holloway was on his third drink when a stranger at the bar made a passing remark about the police. A half-hearted jab meant more as banter than an attack. Holloway didn't see it that way. No one could say who threw the first punch, but by the time the dust settled, Holloway was sprawled on the floor, blood dripping from his lip, his badge hanging loosely from his belt. His suspension was announced the next day, a public humiliation that left him reeling. Natalie watched it all unfold with a quiet thrill, her plan falling into place with surgical precision. Mercer had burned his career to the ground, and Holloway had let his temper make the decision for him. Neither man was thinking clearly anymore, their every move driven by fear, anger, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. She should have felt triumphant, but a voice on the other end of a late-night call gave her pause. "You're walking a tightrope." "Nat," Marcus said, his tone low and heavy with concern. She sat on her couch, staring out at the empty street, the unmarked car that had been tailing her for weeks nowhere in sight. "I'm handling it," she replied, her voice steady. Marcus sighed. "Are you? Because it looks like you're pushing them right where you want them. But what happens when they push back?" "They already have. What happens when they go further?" Natalie didn't answer right away. She'd been so focused on her plan, on watching Mercer and Holloway crumble, that she hadn't stopped to consider the consequences of her own actions. But the seeds were planted, and the game was far from over. The city's pulse thrummed beneath the sodium glow of streetlights. But for Natalie, the night was a canvas of calculated vengeance. She had orchestrated this moment from the shadows, her every move a deliberate thread in a tapestry of retribution. The fear her targets had once wielded against her cold, sharp, and suffocating, she now turned back on them, forcing them to taste the dread they'd sown. Yet control, she knew, was a fragile thing. If desperation took hold, if recklessness consumed them, The string she pulled so deftly might slip from her grasp. Marcus, her confidant, let out a soft sigh, his voice tinged with concern. You sure you're ready for what's coming? Natalie's gaze lingered on the street beyond, her fingers gripping the couch's edge like a lifeline. Yeah, she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm within. I am. Mercer was unraveling, his once imposing presence reduced to a quivering wreck. Natalie had watched his descent with meticulous care, noting how paranoia had seeped into every corner of his life. The swagger that had defined him arrogant, untouchable, had crumbled after he drew his weapon on an undercover investigator. A reckless act that cost him his reputation in the department, his gambling debts, a noose tightening with each passing day, had drawn predators who circled, hungry for their due. His resignation from the force was a feeble attempt at salvation, a belief that fading from the public eye might shield him from the inevitable. But Natalie wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Mercer had spent years hiding behind his badge, using it as a bludgeon against those he deemed powerless. He'd terrorized the vulnerable, secure in the knowledge that the system would bury complaints, that his uniform would deflect consequences. His gambling addiction had exposed a crack in his armor, but Natalie wanted more than vulnerability. She wanted him to know true powerlessness, to feel the ground dissolve beneath him. Her first move was subtle yet chilling, a single bullet casing, placed with precision on the hood of his car, accompanied by a note in stark, bold letters. You won't see it coming. From her vantage point across the street, shrouded in darkness, Natalie observed as Mercer emerged into the frigid night. His movements were sluggish, his head bowed as if weighed down by another hangover. Then his eyes caught the casing. His body froze, every muscle taut, his fingers twitching as if unsure whether to touch the small, gleaming threat. His gaze darted wildly, scouring the empty lot, probing the shadows for answers. His breath came in short, jagged gasps. Who's there? He croaked, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. Natalie remained still, a silent specter. Mercer's trembling hand finally seized the casing, turning it over as if it might whisper its secrets. His head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for a holster that no longer held a gun, a badge, or any shred of authority. She let him marinate in that terror, savoring the sight of his unraveling. Then, stepping just into the edge of his vision, she revealed herself. Mercer's breath hissed out, his body stiffening as recognition dawned. You, he rasped, disbelief choking his words. Natalie didn't give him a moment to regroup. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, her fist slamming into his ribs with surgical precision. He stumbled back against his car, wheezing, pain radiating through him. His hands flailed, seeking balance. But she was relentless, driving a knee into his stomach. He doubled over, gasping, his forehead pressed against the cold metal of his car door. You enjoyed putting people down, didn't you? Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, echoing the tone he'd used years ago when he and Holloway had arrested her. Let's see how you like it. Before he could recover, she swept his legs from under him. He hit the pavement hard, his head bouncing off the concrete with a sickening thud. He groaned, rolling onto his side, coughing violently. Stop, he pleaded, his voice barely audible. Natalie crouched beside him, seizing his collar and yanking him up until their faces were inches apart. You think I don't know who you are, she said, her tone low, conversational, yet laced with menace. Every person you harassed, every complaint you buried, every report that vanished, I found it all. His bloodshot eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. Every excessive force complaint, every misunderstanding that ended it with you beating someone down because you thought no one could touch you. He coughed, his breath shallow. You don't know. She released him abruptly, letting his head smack the pavement again. Standing, she said, turn on the news tomorrow. You might recognize a few names. Mercer wheezed, his chest heaving unevenly. But Natalie didn't linger. She reached into her pocket and dropped another bullet casing beside him. He flinched as it clinked against the ground. You're going to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, she said. her voice almost gentle. And the best part, you'll never know if I'm really there. She turned and walked away, her steps measured, unhurried. She didn't need to look back to know Mercer wouldn't rise anytime soon. By morning, his name was plastered across every news outlet. Former officer under fire as past complaints resurface. Stories of his victims, long silenced, now scream from headlines. His colleagues offered no defense, and the department scrambled to disown him. Mercer was finished, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale, and Natalie, she'd gotten what she wanted. But Mercer was only part of the equation. Holloway was a different beast, calculating, cunning, a master at bending the system to his will. He'd spent years ensuring complaints vanished, making people disappear from records while keeping his hands pristine. Even after his suspension following a bar fight, he believed he could claw his way back with time and connections. Natalie was determined to deny him that chance. She'd already set his downfall in motion. Internal affairs was circling, whispers of his shady real estate schemes growing louder, the kind of scrutiny no favor could erase, but she needed him to feel it the moment his carefully constructed control slipped away. Holloway's empire was built on hidden money, funneled through a maze of LLCs designed to keep his name clean while he profited from fraudulent property deals. But Natalie, with Angela's help, had unraveled it all. Strategic digital breadcrumbs and anonymous tips ensured the IRS took notice, and the city's property fraud unit began digging into his transactions. A single report to his bank triggered a freeze on his accounts. At first, Holloway dismissed it as a clerical error, a problem he could smooth over. But the calls, inquiries, and letters from investigators piled up, each one chipping away at his confidence. His empire of lies was collapsing. Natalie bided her time, tracking his movements, noting how his drinking had spiraled. He spent nights drowning his stress in whiskey, convincing himself he was still untouchable. But he was slipping, his judgment clouded. One night, after he stumbled out of a bar, his gait uneven, his posture tense, she followed. He was too lost in his thoughts to sense her closing in. Then she struck a clean, brutal punch to his ribs that sent him staggering into an alley. He grunted, clutching his side as he spun around. What the hell? Her fist slammed into his gut, cutting off his words. He doubled over, eyes wide with shock. His reflexes, dulled by alcohol, were no match for her precision. You always liked throwing people around, didn't you? She said, her voice steady, controlled. Let's see how you handle it. Holloway snarled, swinging wildly, but she dodged effortlessly, driving her knee into his ribs before twisting his arm behind his back. He cursed, struggling, but she held him firm. Still think you're in charge, she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. You, he gasped, fury and desperation mingling in his voice. You think this changes anything? She wrenched his arm higher, making him choke. It already has. With a final shove, she slammed him against the alley wall, his chest colliding with the brick. He groaned, his forehead scraping the rough surface as he fought to steady himself. You think I don't know what you've been doing, she said, her voice unrelenting. In the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, Natalie's voice cut through the cool night air, low and steady, like a blade honed over years of resentment. Every person you betrayed, every complaint you buried, every small business that you ground into dust just to line your pockets, it's all catching it up to you now. Brent Holloway's breaths came in ragged gasps, his face contorted with pain and defiance. You've got nothing on me, he snarled, his voice thick with venom. Natalie's lips curled into a sharp, knowing smirk. Oh, you'll see soon enough. By morning, you'll understand. She released her grip on him, watching as he stumbled forward, barely keeping his balance. He whirled around, his lip curling into a sneer, but Natalie caught the flicker in his eyes, a crack in his armor. The dawning realization that she wasn't playing games. Her hand dipped into her pocket, and with a casual flick, she tossed a crumpled newspaper at his feet. Holloway hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. His expression darkened as he scanned the bold headline, Corrupt Real Estate Schemes Tied to Suspended Officer Brent Holloway. His carefully constructed empire, his secrets, his power, his legacy was now laid bare for the world to see. He staggered back, hands trembling, his voice barely a whisper. You don't know what you've unleashed. Natalie stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, unflinching. I know exactly what I've done. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the alley, his world collapsing around him. By dawn, Holloway's name was plastered across every news outlet. Investigations into his fraudulent real estate deals had exploded into the public eye. His properties were under scrutiny, his bank accounts frozen, and his legal troubles mounted like a tidal wave. The police department, once his shield, distanced itself with ruthless efficiency, refusing to even acknowledge his name. 2 days later, he tendered his resignation. A week after that, he was gone, fleeing the city he had once ruled with an iron grip. Natalie stood on her porch, arms crossed loosely, watching as the moving truck rumbled out of Holloway's driveway. He was behind the wheel of his car, trailing the truck, his shoulders slumped like a man crushed under the weight of his own choices. There was no grand exit, no defiant gesture, no final glance back at the empire he'd lost. Just a broken man driving away from everything he'd built. Natalie had seen him at the height of his power, lording over the city like a king. Now she watched him leave with nothing. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a deep, cleansing breath. It was over. The neighborhood felt different now, as if a shadow had lifted. The air was lighter, free from the oppressive weight of Holloway's presence. The constant unease, the sense of being watched, of waiting for his next move had vanished. The street was calm, quieter than it had been in months, its silence a stark contrast to the chaos that had sparked this reckoning. Behind her, the familiar sound of footsteps approached, steady and unhurried. You gonna savor this victory? Or are you already plotting your next crusade? The voice was warm, teasing, but carried a knowing edge. Natalie's smirk returned, though she didn't turn to face her friend. You always know how to kill the vibe, Angela. Angela stepped up beside her, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. The night was still, the only sound the faint hum of a car passing in the distance. Unlike Natalie, Angela wasn't watching the truck disappear down the street. Her gaze was fixed on her friend. You won, she said, her tone steady, almost neutral. You took down 2 crooked cops and made sure they felt every second of their fall. That's gotta feel good, right? Natalie tilted her head, considering the words. It does, she admitted, her voice softer than usual. Angela nodded, but her expression remained unreadable. And yet, here you are, standing on your porch like you're waiting for the next shoe to drop. Natalie didn't respond. The truth was, she was waiting. Not for Holloway or his lackey Mercer, they were finished, their names reduced to headlines and cautionary tales. But the world had a way of never letting her rest. There was always another fight, another shadow lurking just out of sight. She'd spent her life in battle, first in uniform, then in a city that had never fully embraced her. Peace was a fleeting visitor, never a permanent guest. Angela sighed, shifting her weight. You did what had to be done, Nat. But you know this doesn't fix the bigger mess. Right? Natalie's fingers tapped lightly against her arm, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Yeah, she said quietly. Angela studied her for a moment, then shook her head with a faint smile. Just don't let the fight become all you are. The words hit harder than Natalie expected, stirring something she wasn't ready to face. You sound like Marcus, she said, her smirk softening. Angela snorted. Now that's just rude. A quiet laugh escaped Natalie, but Angela's words lingered, pressing against a truth she didn't want to examine too closely. She'd thought about it before, the possibility of a life where she didn't have to keep fighting, where she could just be without bracing for the next blow. But when had that ever been an option? Even before Holloway, before the military, the world had never let her rest. She wasn't sure she even knew what peace felt like anymore. They stood in silence, watching as the taillights of Holloway's car vanished around a corner, a final permanent exit. Angela stretched her arms above her head, her posture loosening. All right, your revenge saga's over. I'm starving. You coming? Or are you going to brood out here all night like some vigilante? Natalie shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I'll catch up. Angela gave her a look sharp, meaningful, but didn't press. Instead, she clapped Natalie on the shoulder, the gesture warm and grounding. Don't go picking another fight, she called as she headed to her car. At least, not tonight. Natalie didn't answer. She wasn't sure she knew how to stop. Minutes later, another car pulled up, its headlights briefly cutting through the darkness before shutting off. The engine idled, then fell silent. Marcus stepped out, his gaze drifting to Holloway's empty house, where a for sale sign stood like a tombstone marking the end of an era. His lips pressed into a thin line as he took in the sight, then turned to Natalie. He climbed the porch steps slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, his movements deliberate, as if choosing his words with care. You did it, he said simply, his voice low. Natalie nodded once. Yeah. Silence settled between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Marcus exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You know I don't agree with how you went about this, he said, his tone laced with exhaustion and something like reluctant respect. I know, Natalie replied, her voice steady. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Marcus had always been the one trying to do things the right way, clinging to a moral code even when the system failed them. But even he knew that sometimes the rules weren't enough. I get it, he added quietly, and that was as close to approval as she'd ever get. Natalie studied him for a moment, then tilted her head. Dinner, Marcus let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, all right. But you're paying? Figured, she said, a faint smile breaking through. As he turned to head back to his car, she lingered on the porch, watching him walk away. She could tell he wanted to say more. That part of him was relieved Holloway and Mercer were gone. But Marcus wasn't the type to admit it. He still believed in justice, in a system that was supposed to work, even if it rarely did for people like them. Natalie stayed where she was, letting the quiet of the night wrap around her. The street was still, free from the tension that had hung over it for weeks. No unmarked cars lurked in the shadows. No cryptic threats were scrawled on her door. No sense of danger loomed just out of reach. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. But she was still ready. She didn't regret what she'd done, not a single moment of it. There was no guilt, no second guessing. She'd done what was necessary, and she'd done it her way. With a slow breath, she gripped the porch railing, then turned and stepped inside. The deadbolt clicked into place with a quiet finality. If trouble came again, and she knew it would, she'd be prepared. Life had taught her one unshakable truth. Peace was never permanent. The neighborhood had changed, though the shift was subtle, invisible to those who didn't know the story. The streets looked the same. The houses stood as they always had, and the residents went about their lives walking dogs, tending gardens, waving to neighbors. But there was a calmness in the air, a sense of resolution. Natalie jogged her usual route, her stride steady, her breath even. The city felt lighter, as if it, too, had exhaled. Her breath came steady and even as she jogged along the familiar path, the same stretch of road she'd traveled that fateful morning when Mercer had pulled her over. It was here, on this very pavement, that they'd shamed her, slapped cuffs on her wrists, and thrown accusations that cut deeper than any blade. They'd branded her as something she wasn't, an outsider who didn't belong. The memory of that day lingered like a bruise, tender and raw. Back then, she'd been made to feel small, unwelcome, as if the ground beneath her feet belonged to everyone but her. Now, though, the street was hers. No one was left to challenge her right to be here, to question her every step. She moved with a newfound ease, her body light. The tension that had once knotted her muscles dissolved. Gone was the creeping paranoia that had shadowed her days, the constant dread of being watched, of standing on the edge of another confrontation. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. The road stretched out before her, open and unclaimed, and she ran with the confidence of someone who knew it was hers as much as anyone's. Her pace remained steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The world around her felt quieter, softer, as if it, too, had exhaled a long-held breath. By the time she reached her house, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. Long shadows stretched across the porch steps, dancing in the fading light. She slowed to a walk, stretching her arms above her head, savoring the stillness that enveloped her. No suspicious cars idled down the block. No unmarked vans loomed outside her home. No hateful messages were scrawled across her door. No crude warnings to unsettle her peace. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of solitude, not loneliness, but a true, unshackled aloneness, the kind that carried no threats, no burdens pressing down on her shoulders. She stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards solid and reassuring beneath her feet. As she reached for the door, her fingers brushed the cool metal of the lock. Turning it, she felt a faint smile tug at her lips, not a grin of victory or a smirk of defiance, but something quieter, deeper. It was the smile of someone who knew. Holloway and Mercer, for all their years of arrogance, had believed they were untouchable. They'd thought they could act without consequence, that no one would ever dare stand against them. But they'd learned the hard way that some battles can't be sidestepped, and some people aren't meant to be defeated.